Last weekend, of course, a car was driven into people in Charlottesville, Virginia. This morning, as we've been hearing, a van was driven into people in Barcelona. What those events have in common is the weapon and also the enmity. These are hate crimes. The terror in Europe, fueled by Islamic extremist groups like IS and Al-Qaeda, is relatively recent. In America, the roots of this race hate can be traced back to the Civil War and, of course, well before. Slavery, lynching, segregation, the assassination of African-American leaders like Medgar Evers, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And on Saturday, the death of an anti-racism protester, Heather Heyer, who was white, but protesting against and killed by white supremacists. Yes, the striking message from America is how long hatred can survive. A warning, some of the language in this report is confronting. It could be Barcelona this morning. It was Charlottesville on the weekend. The same crime, born of hatred, to drive a vehicle into strangers.
Let's just mow down all of these people.
Vice News has made an extraordinary fly-on-the-wall documentary about what happened at Charlottesville. It's utterly, terribly compelling, in part because of men like Christopher Campbell, a white nationalist who says things like this.
I'm not even saying we're non-violent. I'm saying that we didn't aggress. We did not initiate force against anybody. We're not non-violent. We'll fucking kill these people if we have to.
And a short time after he said that, someone did.
Just ran down all of these people.
So, just days apart, in Barcelona and Charlottesville, vehicles driven into people, fueled by hate. Earlier this week, a journalist named Robin Wright wrote an extraordinary piece for The New Yorker with the title, "Is America Headed for a New Kind of Civil War?" In part, she approached the question,
as someone who's covered wars my entire life, dating back to the 1973 war in the Middle East.
And after Charlottesville, she told me,
it is haunting to look at the kinds of wars that are playing out abroad and think that we face some of the very same problems in the United States today.
So what do these events have in common? Is it the anger from the margins that fueled them? I asked Robin Wright. You wrote a book called Rock the Casbah, Rage and Rebellion Across the Islamic World, and in part that considered the radicalization of people at the edges of the Islamic world. Are we seeing a kind of radicalization of some of the sorts of white people who might participate in neo-Nazi alt-right movements in the United States?
It's a good question and an interesting comparison. Obviously, our societies are very different. The flashpoints couldn't be more different. But the idea, the alienation, the marginalization of a group of people who feel that the politicians are not doing enough for them, that they have to take action into their own hands, and they feel emboldened. They feel that they don't have other recourse. I think there are some similarities there.
But Robin Wright says there is a difference, and it's history.
The difference with the United States is that we went through a very violent and devastating existential civil war 150 years ago. And what's occurring to a lot of people who've studied conflict and who've studied the Civil War is that we may never have answered some of the basic questions that emerged during the Civil War.
Remember, events in Charlottesville began because alt-right white people, including neo-Nazis, came from throughout the United States to oppose the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee, a commander in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. 152 years after his surrender, the divisions the Civil War spoke of still, at some level, in some hearts, exist. Among the abuse hurled at people by white nationalists in Charlottesville was the N-word, still. Nina Simone from 1966, its famous opening line.
My skin is black.
Half a century later, Jay-Z has sampled it.
My
skin is black. My
building it into a new song about the experience of being black.
Light nigga, dog nigga, faux nigga, real nigga, rich nigga, po nigga, house nigga, feel nigga.
Have you ever been called the N-word?
Absolutely. On my job. Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's Tanisha Hudson, a young woman from Charlottesville who was there on Saturday when the violence broke out. I saw her in that brilliant Vice documentary in which she said, "I don't know what other way to put it. I stand here as a young black lady and I feel like I'm living through Jim Crow." Our producer, Bridget Burke, found her number and I called her.
I knew about Jim Crow because my grandfather grew up in the heart of Scottsdale, Esmont, Virginia. Esmont, Virginia is a small town outside of Charlottesville, about 20 minutes south of Charlottesville. My grandfather experienced his own racism. So his stories he passed down to us.
And here's the confounding thing. Those were historical stories from her grandfather, but the language the white supremacists brought to Charlottesville over the weekend and the names Tanisha Hudson has been called again and again are the same. And when they call you that, they're doing it with hate, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Pure hate.
In short, slavery ended, the lynching stopped, a black president was elected twice. But Tanisha Hudson will tell you the hatred hasn't ended. She saw it on the weekend in the faces of the people who came from throughout America to Charlottesville, out of her grandfather's history and into her present.
They were about hate. They can make a million excuses and say that they were not about hate. They can make a million excuses and say that they're not racist. Everything they stand for is hate.
Which brings us back to Robin Wright.
So 150 years later, we're still dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War, and that's what's become clear to so many Americans in the last 3 days.
Robin Wright says the American lesson is that it can and does continue to happen. Old enmities surviving, tribal hatred finding expression through new and reinvented forms.
Now, when people talk about another civil war, nobody's talking about what we went through in the middle of the 19th century, which was fighting from trenches with neat geographical boundaries in pitched battles. So, you know, civil wars, as you know, as well as I, have evolved, particularly over the last 60 years, where they're played out not on front lines. The locations shift. There's episodic violence. It's not every day fighting one side against the other.
And now in Europe, the same kind of shifting locations, episodic violence and hate from within. Brussels, Paris, Nice, Barcelona. It can't happen here, people said, but it can and it does. And what America can tell you is that hatred survives. Robin Wright, journalist, read me a quote from Murat Halstead, journalist, that's a century and a half old.
And Murat Halstead wrote, "The lesson of the war that should never depart from us is that the American people have no exemption from the ordinary state of humankind. If we sin, we must suffer for our sins like the empires that are tottering and the nations that have perished." Americans have always thought of themselves as an exception, and now we're finding we're not.
My skin is black.
Nina Simone and Jay-Z ending that report. Before that, Robin Wright, and you can read her excellent journalism in The New Yorker.